Power, wealth, and absolute control cannot stop a blizzard. Billionaire CEO Vanessa Carmichael thought she commanded the world until a treacherous mountain storm stripped away her empire, leaving her fighting for her life. What happens when the woman who has everything owes her survival to a man who has nothing? Stephen's past was supposed to be clear. Vanessa Carmichael, the 32-year-old CEO of Carmichael Global Logistics, had checked the weather reports herself before leaving her Bellevue penthouse. She gripped the heated leather steering wheel of her customized Mercedes G-Wagon, her knuckles turning a pale shade of porcelain against the black interior. She was driving alone, a rare occurrence, but this meeting required absolute discretion. She was en route to a secluded estate in the Cascade Mountains to secure the proxy votes of Arthur Pendleton, a reclusive board member. Her own CFO, Richard Hayes, a man she had trusted implicitly, a man who had smoothly slipped a diamond ring onto her finger just 3 months prior, was quietly orchestrating a hostile board takeover. Vanessa had discovered the discrepancy in the quarterly offshore accounts only 24 hours ago. If she didn't reach Pendleton tonight, Richard would successfully vote her out of her own grandfather's company by Monday morning. Snowflakes the size of silver dollars began to hurl themselves against the windshield. The weather had turned with a violent, terrifying suddenness. The radio forecasters, previously predicting a mild dusting, were now issuing frantic emergency warnings about an unprecedented localized pressure drop. A freak blizzard was swallowing the mountains. Vanessa pressed the accelerator, eager to beat the worsening conditions. The luxury SUV surged forward, the heavy tires crunching through the rapidly accumulating powder. But as she navigated a steep, winding switchback, a sharp, metallic grind echoed from the undercarriage. The dashboard, usually a sleek display of digital gauges, suddenly lit up in a terrifying array of red warning symbols. The check engine light flashed frantically, followed immediately by the complete failure of the power steering. Panic, a foreign emotion to a woman who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions before breakfast, flared in her chest. She slammed her foot on the brake pedal. It went straight to the floorboard with zero resistance. "No, no, no," Vanessa hissed, wrestling with a heavy steering wheel as the 2-ton vehicle careened toward the edge of the guardrail. With sheer adrenaline fueling her, she wrenched the wheel toward the mountain wall, intentionally scraping the side of the pristine vehicle against the jagged rock face to bleed off speed. Metal shrieked against stone in a deafening, agonizing protest. The SUV shuddered violently, spun half a degree, and finally plowed deep into a dense snowbank on the shoulder of the pass, the engine choking out a final, pathetic sputter before dying completely. Silence crashed down around her, heavy and absolute, broken only by the howling wind outside. Vanessa sat paralyzed for a moment, her chest heaving against her silk blouse and tailored cashmere blazer. She reached for her phone. No service. She tapped the emergency satellite connection built into the console. The screen remained dead. A cold realization began to pool in her stomach, entirely separate from the dropping temperature outside. Her customized vehicle was meticulously maintained. It had just been in the shop yesterday for a comprehensive winterization check, a check orchestrated by Richard's preferred executive auto team. The brake line failure, the dead emergency comms. This wasn't bad luck. It was an assassination attempt dressed up as a tragic winter accident. Within 30 minutes, the residual heat in the cabin evaporated. The blizzard outside was a swirling wall of impenetrable white. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was plummeting into the single digits. Vanessa shivered violently, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She had no survival gear, only a designer trench coat, leather gloves, and ankle boots meant for corporate boardrooms, not sub-zero survival. Staying in the car meant freezing to death by midnight. The last road sign she had passed indicated a small service road leading to a ranger station or a logging camp about a mile back. If she could walk it, she might find shelter. Forcing the heavy door open against the wind, Vanessa stepped out into the tempest. The sheer force of the gale nearly knocked her off her feet. The snow was already knee-deep, pulling at her boots like wet cement. She wrapped her coat tightly around herself, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached, and began to walk. Every step was an agonizing battle against the elements. The wind screamed in her ears, stealing her breath. Ice crystals lashed her exposed face like tiny knives. Within 15 minutes, her feet were completely numb. Her mind, usually a sharp, calculated instrument of business strategy, began to blur. She found herself thinking of the stock prices, of Richard's smug smile, of the fact that she had never taken a real vacation. She was worth $4 billion, and all of it was useless out here. Her foot caught on a submerged rock. Vanessa tumbled forward, face first, into the freezing snow. She tried to push herself up, but her arms felt like lead. The darkness was closing in, and strangely, the biting frost was giving way to a deceptive, lethargic warmth. Closing her eyes just for a moment seemed like the most logical business decision she could make. As her consciousness faded, a heavy beam of yellow light swept across the snowstorm, accompanied by the low, steady growl of a diesel engine. But Vanessa was already too far gone to hear it. Lester Clark was not a man easily rattled. Spending a decade as a lead paramedic in downtown Seattle had trained him to view chaos through a lens of absolute, terrifying calm. When his wife passed away 3 years ago, he had traded the screaming sirens of the city for the quiet solitude of the Cascades, buying a small, sturdy cabin and an old hardware store in a town with a population of 200. He needed peace for himself and a safe grounding environment for his 7-year-old son, Leif. The weather scanner in his truck had warned of the front, and Lester was on his way back from delivering emergency firewood to an elderly neighbor when he saw the deep gouges in the snowbank on the highway. He parked his battered Ford F-250, flipped on the amber hazard lights, and grabbed his medical kit. He found her 50 yards from the road, a dark, motionless lump half buried in the drifting snow. Lester dropped to his knees, immediately clearing the snow from her face. Her skin was ashen, her lips a frightening shade of blue. He checked her pulse ready, weak, barely there. She was in the advanced stages of hypothermia. Without wasting a second, he scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. He carried her back to the truck, laying her across the extended cab's back seat, wrapping her tightly in the thermal blankets he always kept stock. He drove with calculated aggression, fighting the whiteout conditions until the familiar shape of his A-frame cabin emerged from the timberline. When Vanessa finally clawed her way back to consciousness, the first thing she registered was the smell. It wasn't the sterile, filtered air of her penthouse, nor the sharp tang of ozone from the storm. It was the rich, earthy scent of burning cedar and slow-cooking chicken broth. She peeled her eyes open. The ceiling above her was made of exposed, rough-hewn pine logs. She was lying on a plush, slightly worn leather sofa, buried under a mountain of heavy handmade quilts. The agonizing cold was gone, replaced by a deep, radiant heat emanating from a massive stone fireplace just a few feet away. She tried to sit up, but her muscles screamed in protest. She realized her wet clothes had been replaced by a pair of oversized, soft flannel pajamas. Panic spiked. "I wouldn't move too fast if I were you. Your core temperature took a severe hit." Nessa snapped her head toward the sound. A man stood in the doorway of what looked like a small kitchen. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing faded denim and a thermal Henley. He had dark, unkempt hair, a rugged shadow of a beard, and eyes the color of a stormy ocean. He held a steaming mug in one hand. "Where am I?" Vanessa demanded, her voice a raspy whisper. She tried to inject her usual corporate authority into her tone, but it failed miserably. "Who are you? Where are my clothes?" Lester stepped fully into the room, his expression unreadable and thoroughly unbothered by her sharp tone. "You're in my cabin, about 10 miles from where you decided to take a nap in a blizzard. My name is Lester, and your clothes are currently in the dryer because they were frozen solid to your skin. Don't worry, my son and I practice strict patient confidentiality." "Your son," Vanessa repeated, disoriented. As if on cue, a small boy with messy brown hair and large, curious eyes peeked out from behind Lester's leg. He was holding a worn sketchbook and a green crayon. "This is Leif," Lester said softly, resting a large hand on the boy's head. "He's the one who picked out the pajamas for you. They belong to me." But he thought the plaid was festive. Leif offered a shy wave. "You looked like a frozen popsicle," the boy stated matter-of-factly. Despite her immediate need to regain control of the situation, Vanessa felt a strange, tight sensation in her chest at the sight of the boy. "Thank you, Laith. The plaid is lovely." She looked back at Lester, her CEO instincts kicking back in. "I need a phone. Immediately. I have to contact my office in Bellevue. It's a matter of corporate security." Lester walked over and set the steaming mug of broth on a rustic wooden coffee table next to her. "Lines are down. Cell towers are frozen over. You're not calling anyone tonight or tomorrow either by the look of the forecast." "You don't understand," Vanessa said, pushing herself up on her elbows, the quilts falling slightly. "I am Vanessa Carmichael. I run Carmichael Global. I have access to private evacuation helicopters." "If you can just get me a signal, Miss Carmichael," Lester interrupted, his voice low and incredibly steady. He didn't blink at her name. He didn't care about her money. "I was a paramedic for 10 years. Right now you are a patient who narrowly avoided severe frostbite and cardiac arrest. Even if I could call a chopper, no pilot is flying into this suit. You are grounded. Drink the broth." Vanessa stared at him, stunned. No one spoke to her like that. Men in $1,000 suits cowered when she raised an eyebrow. This man in a $10 thermal shirt was giving her orders in her own defense. She looked from Lester to the mug, then to little Laith, who was watching her with unabashed fascination. Defeated by geography and biology, Vanessa reached out with trembling hands and took the mug. The broth was incredibly rich and instantly warming. Lester sat in a heavy armchair opposite the sofa, watching her assessingly. "Your car," he began, his tone shifting from medical professional to something sharper. "When I found you, I checked the vehicle to make sure no one else was inside. I noticed the front left wheel well. The brake line was severed, not snapped from the cold and not torn by debris. It looked like a clean cut." Vanessa stopped drinking. The warmth of the broth vanished, replaced by the icy dread she had felt on the mountain pass. Richard. He really had tried to kill her. "I know," she whispered, the corporate armor cracking just a fraction, revealing the terrified woman underneath. She looked up at Lester, expecting to see pity or doubt. Instead, she saw a quiet, fierce protectiveness settle into his eyes. "All right," Lester said simply, leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Then we make sure whoever did it doesn't know you survived. Until the road's clear, you're safe here. Nobody comes up this mountain without me knowing about it." For the first time in her life, Vanessa Carmichael, the billionaire who controlled everything, felt entirely safe in the hands of someone else. As the wind howled outside, beating uselessly against the thick logs of the cabin, she looked at the single father and his young son, realizing her neatly structured, cutthroat world was about to be irrevocably turned upside down. For 3 days, the relentless blizzard held the mountain captive, burying the landscape under 4 feet of impassable, pristine white. Inside the sturdy log cabin, however, a profound shift was taking place, one that had nothing to do with the barometric pressure. Vanessa Carmichael, a woman who meticulously scheduled her life down to the fiscal quarter, found herself completely untethered from time. Stripped of her corporate armor, her ringing cell phones, and her relentless schedule, she experienced a bizarre, terrifying serenity. She spent her mornings helping Lester cook breakfast on a cast-iron skillet, clumsily flipping pancakes under his amused, watchful gaze. She spent her afternoons sitting by the massive stone hearth, listening to little Laith explain the intricate backstories of the superheroes he drew in his worn sketchbook. For the first time in her 32 years, Vanessa wasn't anticipating the next crisis or fending off the next corporate shark. She was simply existing, and she was watching Lester. He was entirely unlike the men in her world. The executives and hedge fund managers she dated were manicured, hyper-ambitious, and constantly calculating their next leverage. Lester was grounded, possessing a quiet, unshakable strength. When he looked at her, his stormy gray eyes didn't see a multi-billion-dollar empire or a stepping stone to power. He saw a woman. He saw her. On the evening of the 3rd day, the howling wind finally began to die down. Lester emerged from the back utility room, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "I managed to get the old shortwave radio working," he announced, his deep voice breaking the quiet crackle of the fire. "The local emergency broadcast is up. Snowplows are hitting the main pass. We should be able to get down the mountain by tomorrow afternoon. Vanessa's stomach plummeted. Tomorrow. The real world was coming back. Did you hear any news from Seattle? She asked, her voice tightening. Lester hesitated, his jaw setting into a hard line. He walked over and sat on the edge of the coffee table, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. I managed to catch a signal from a Seattle AM news station. Vanessa, it's bad. She sat up straighter, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. Tell me. Carmichael Global Logistics released a public statement this morning, Lester said grimly. They've reported you as missing and presumed dead after your vehicle's tracking signal was lost in the avalanche zone on Stevens Pass. The board convened an emergency session. Richard, Vanessa breathed, her eyes widening in fury. Yes, Richard Hayes has been named acting CEO. The broadcast mentioned he is fast-tracking an aggressive restructuring plan to stabilize the plunging stock. He's signing a binding agreement to sell off Carmichael's primary shipping fleet and real estate assets to Bain Capital tomorrow at 4 p.m. They are holding the signing publicly at the Rainier Club in downtown Seattle to reassure investors. The betrayal was a physical blow, punching the breath from her lungs. Richard wasn't just stealing her grandfather's legacy. He was carving it up and selling it for parts to a private equity firm. He had orchestrated her murder, and now he was dancing on her grave while cashing $1 billion check. Vanessa closed her eyes, her hands balling into fists so tight her fingernails dug into her palms. The sheer audacity, the absolute, unadulterated greed. When she opened her eyes, the vulnerability was gone. The billionaire CEO was back, and her gaze was lethal. Lester, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. I need to get to the Rainier Club by 3:30 p.m. tomorrow. Can your truck make it? Lester looked at the fire blazing in her eyes. A slow, respectful smirk touched the corner of his mouth. Miss Carmichael, my truck can drive through a brick wall if I ask it to. We'll be there. Good, Vanessa said, her mind racing, formulating a counterattack. But I need one more thing. Does that radio have two-way transmission capability? It does, Lester nodded. I can bounce a signal off the repeater tower in the valley. Get me a line to a private unlisted number in Mercer Island, Vanessa instructed, throwing off the quilt and standing up. Her oversized flannel pajamas did nothing to diminish the commanding aura radiating from her. I need to speak to Arthur Pendleton, and then I need to make a call to the Seattle Police Department. For the next 4 hours, Lester watched in silent awe as Vanessa Carmichael orchestrated a corporate war from a rustic cabin dining table using a crackling shortwave radio. She was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly captivating. As she finalized her plans, securing her vengeance with surgical precision, Lester realized that while he had saved her from the storm, she was a hurricane in her own right. And heaven help the man who had tried to cross her. The Rainier Club was a bastion of Seattle's elite. Its mahogany-paneled walls and crystal chandeliers reeking of old money and exclusive power. Inside the grand boardroom, the atmosphere was a mix of somber mourning and electric anticipation. Richard Hayes stood at the head of the massive polished table, wearing a bespoke Brioni suit that cost more than Lester Clark's truck. He looked appropriately grave, dabbing his eyes with a silk handkerchief for the benefit of the press cameras lining the back of the room. Vanessa was more than a visionary leader. She was my fiancée, Richard announced to the room, his voice perfectly modulated to express profound grief. A tragic loss in the mountains has left a void in our hearts and in Carmichael Global. But she would have wanted us to push forward to ensure the survival of her grandfather's legacy. I am prepared to sign this asset transfer with Bain Capital today, securing our future. He reached into his breast pocket, pulling out a solid gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. The representatives from Bain Capital leaned forward, greedy anticipation gleaming in their eyes. The board members, cowed and panicked by the sudden drop in stock, nodded in silent agreement. Richard uncapped the pen. The tip hovered an inch above the signature line. I wouldn't sign that, Richard. Unless you want to add corporate fraud to your list of federal charges. The voice cut through the hushed boardroom like the crack of a whip. Every head in the room snapped toward the heavy double doors. The press corps erupted in a flurry of gasps and flashing bulbs. Vanessa Carmichael stood in the doorway. She was not wearing designer couture. She was wearing Lester's heavy canvas Carhartt jacket draped over her shoulders, a pair of dark denim jeans, and her scuffed, salt-stained leather boots. Her hair was unstyled, cascading in wild waves, and a thin, healing scratch marred her cheekbone. She looked rugged. She looked wild. She looked like a queen who had just warped through fire and emerged forged in steel. Standing immediately behind her, an imposing mountain of a man with storm-gray eyes and a fierce, protective stance, was Lester. "Vanessa?" Richard gasped, his face draining of all color, the golden pen slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering onto the polished wood. "My God, you're alive." "The search and rescue team said that I was buried under 6 feet of snow." Vanessa finished his sentence, stalking into the room. The crowd parted for her instinctively. "I'm sure you paid them very well to give up the search early, Richard. Just like you paid your private mechanic, David Corrin, to sever the brake lines on my G-Wagon." The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. The Bain Capital representatives scrambled backward, suddenly eager to distance themselves from the table. "That is an outrageous lie," Richard shouted, his perfectly curated facade crumbling into sheer panic. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "You're traumatized, Vanessa. The cold has affected your mind. Security, please escort Miss Carmichael to a hospital." "Though security works for me," Vanessa snapped, slamming her hands down on the table, leaning in so close Richard could smell the crisp mountain air still clinging to her clothes. "And as for my mind, it is sharper than ever, which is why I spent last night on a shortwave radio with Arthur Pendleton." Richard choked, his eyes darting toward the empty leather chair reserved for the reclusive board member. "Arthur was horrified to hear about my tragic accident." Vanessa smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a predator. "He was even more horrified to hear about your hostile takeover. So, he formally transferred his proxy voting rights to me, effective at 8 a.m. this morning." She pulled a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper from Lester's jacket pocket and tossed it onto the table. "That gives me a 62% controlling majority of Carmichael Global. The deal with Bain Capital is dead, and you, Richard, are terminated. Effective immediately. You can't do this." Richard shrieked, backing away from the table, his suave demeanor replaced by the frantic flailing of a cornered rat. "I built this quarter's projections. You have no proof of these insane allegations." "Actually," a deep, calm voice interrupted. Lester stepped forward, crossing his arms over his broad chest, his presence easily dominating the panicked executives. "She has plenty. You see, I have friends in the Seattle PD. They paid a visit to your mechanic this morning. Turns out, Mr. Reffitt, Corrin wasn't keen on taking a premeditated murder charge for you. He flipped, surrendered the wire transfer records from your offshore account to his." Right on cue, the heavy doors of the boardroom swung open again. 3 uniformed Seattle police officers, accompanied by a lead detective, marched into the room. "Richard Hayes," the detective asked, producing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and corporate embezzlement. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp, definitive click of the cuffs locking around Richard's wrists. The poetic justice was swift and brutal. The man who had tried to bury Vanessa in the cold darkness of the mountains was now being dragged out into the harsh, flashing lights of the press, his reputation destroyed, his freedom gone, his absolute ruin broadcast live to the world. Karma hadn't just hit back, it had completely flattened him. Vanessa watched without a shred of pity as her ex-fiancé was frog-marched out of the club. When the doors finally closed, she turned to the stunned, breathless board members. "We have a lot of work to do," Vanessa announced, slipping Lester's jacket off and draping it over her chair. Meeting called to order. 6 months later, the corporate world had entirely forgotten the scandal of Richard Hayes, focusing instead on the unprecedented quarterly growth of Carmichael Global under Vanessa's renewed leadership. She was still the fierce, unyielding CEO who commanded empires, but there was a new warmth in her, a grounding force that her competitors couldn't quite identify. It was a Friday evening, and the Bellevue penthouse was uncharacteristically quiet. Vanessa stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering Seattle skyline. She turned as the private elevator chimed. Lester stepped out carrying a sleepy Lath on his shoulder. They had officially moved in 3 months ago. The cabin in the Cascades was now their weekend retreat, a sanctuary from the corporate storms. Traffic was brutal, Lester smiled, carefully transferring Lath to the massive plush sofa and throwing a blanket over him. He walked over to Vanessa, wrapping his strong arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. Vanessa leaned into him, closing her eyes as she absorbed his warmth, the familiar scent of cedar still lingering on his skin. Power, wealth, and absolute control were thrilling, but as Lester pressed a soft kiss to her temple, she knew the truth. The greatest empire she had ever built was right here in his arms. The storm had tried to break her, but instead it had given her exactly what she needed to truly live. Did Vanessa's epic boardroom revenge and her unexpected mountain romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this story of brutal karma, survival, and a billionaire finding true love in the storm, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow drama lovers and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heart-stopping stories every single week. See you next time.